traditional data doesn't work in time. Anyone who's familiar with SQL works in like identifier joins. It's like a VLOOKUP in Excel if you're familiar with that.
Yeah.
So you can't VLOOKUP for time. It's like look at the last 30 days and count how many happened within 30 days of this specific moment. You can't do that in SQL easily. So those kind of questions take thousands of lines of queries.
Welcome to What Gets Measured, a NinjaCat podcast about marketing, performance management, metrics, and effectiveness. Because what gets measured gets managed. I'm your host, Jake Sanders. Ahmed Elsamdisi is the founder and CEO at Narrator.ai, a data modeling platform that allows companies to answer any and all questions about their business's marketing data in minutes. By taking minutes to get answers about data that would normally take days or weeks, Narrator allows companies to better understand their business and make better marketing decisions. Before Narrator, Ahmed was the first member of WeWork's data team. Since founding Narrator, Ahmed graduated from startup accelerator Y Combinator and was named a member of the Forbes 30 Under 30 list for 2021. As if this wasn't impressive enough, Ahmed has decided to pad his resume further and join the NinjaCat podcast today to talk about marketing data management. Ahmed, how are you, sir?
I'm good. How are you?
Excellent. Better now that you're here. Let's just jump in and talk about this WeWork scenario. As the first member of WeWork's data team, you were part of a company in hyper growth. What are some of the lessons you learned from building your data team from 0 to 40?
Yeah, so a couple of major lessons I learned, which is one, don't grow too quickly.
Okay.
I think our team was growing pretty quickly, but like the rest of the company was growing really quickly. At one point, we were hiring 35 new people a week. Like we just didn't know who people were anymore.
Right.
So that's always interesting to see. The second thing is to understand kind of that data scales very, very data questions scale as you hire more people. So the idea of a company, as a company grows, it's going to ask more and more questions that you have not seen before.
Right.
Like, and that's good, right?
Yeah.
However, that in data management causes a lot of issues. The more questions people ask, the more tables you have to build, the more you have to manage, the more that the data team's job becomes trying to like keep this like house of cards from collapsing instead of answering questions. And the even sadder news, where when I went on a tour to try to study every other company, this is the case for everybody in the world. Like every company you talk to that does data, like that's using data, is like, oh yeah, the job of data engineering and the job of data is usually to like maintain the system. And you're like, what do you mean by maintain the system? They're like, well, there's like hundreds of tables. You have to constantly add new tables. You have to make sure that the tables that depend on other tables don't break, and everything is like as well ironed. And I think that's more of a problem of the design of the system and less a problem of the tasks. So I left when I left WeWork to start Narrator. That was one of the biggest lessons, was saying, how do I build a system that is not doesn't scale the same way that data normally scales, doesn't require hundreds of tables. And also, more interestingly, how do you build a system in a reality of a fast growing startup, which means data is messy, you're changing systems every fucking like couple months, like you have new people that don't know anything about like what your data looks like. Like it's just all the nuance of the nothing relates to each other. The system is a mess because it was like hacked together and evolved and now scaling. A good example I like to give is like WeWork's data. WeWork sells offices and desks.
Right.
Yet if you look at WeWork's data, there's nothing called an office or a desk.
Interesting.
So like what actually happens is that WeWork has evolved to sell so many different things, and the idea of a cell is like or something that's sellable and it can be reserved, and now that reservable has some and it's all these weird things that you have to do. So when you're asking basic questions like how many desks did we sell this month, it is a pipeline. Like a lot of things have to happen. And of course, with any startup, there's like Microsoft comes in and they want some custom deal, and now all your data has some weird edge case because Microsoft messed it up, and this other enterprise deal is weird, and you have all these weird deals. So like that's the reality of data, and you have to build a system that works in that environment, and you have to work in a system that's designed for that environment. And I think that whenever I looked everywhere, nobody built a system to answer questions that were designed in that environment. Everyone was building it for a really perfect world. And they leave the data engineers to make it perfect so that their system data could work. So we went in and said, let's build something for the shit.
I love that. And so You're talking about like naming, hierarchy and labeling kind of being off from the reportable metrics that folks are looking at. And in some way, you may think it's good to democratize the data. It's available to everybody. But if a company has data analysts and engineers on staff, is it necessary to democratize the data so everyone has access?
So the answer is yes and no. I think that democratizing the data is really important. And I would say democratize the insights, democratize the analyses, democratize asking questions. What ends up happening with democratization of data is you give people like thousands of dashboards or tables that they don't know the nuances or the assumptions of, and they say, good luck. And when you do that, what ends up happening is that you're not democratizing misinformation. It's like you're giving people like a textbook and you're saying, pick random words and tell me if you find something interesting. It's like, so you as a data team end up having to like do a lot of backpedaling. Like, oh, like you saw two plots on top of each other and you think they're related, but they're not related. Or
Right.
you see something and you misinterpret it. What does that mean? That 70% of our customers who churned also submitted a ticket. Like, is that bad? Is that good? What does that really mean? If everyone submits a ticket to churn, like it's those weird piece of data that I think is really, really misleading. So
Mm.
I'm much more fan of like keeping your data clean, organized, and like giving something that's more usable for people to ask. Like I think people should be able to ask and answer their own questions because your data team won't be able to scale.
Mm.
Like there's just too many questions and it takes too long to answer questions. Like narrator is definitely like a game changer in that, but the way we do it requires like it's kind of like the way we believe in democratizing data, which is like define your business concepts, create storylines per customers, and give them to people so that people can arrange and investigate and really explore the customer journey and ask and answer those hard questions easily
Mhm.
versus just give them access to raw data and be like, good luck. And then I also like the idea of analyses being context first. So we, a narrator, don't provide dashboards, we provide narratives. And narratives are stories. So you start with text, conclusions, text, and explaining. So when people like see the plots, they're getting the plots and the visualization in the context of something that the analyst is trying to communicate. So I find that really, really, really just a better way for people to engage and act with data. Otherwise, it just leaves it blank.
So in traditional data teams, why is part of that thing that it takes weeks to answer questions about marketing data is you're doing that backpedaling. You're trying to figure out the ticket submissions. You're trying to figure out the naming hierarchy. I mean, what are some other barriers that are preventing data teams from answering questions about marketing data?
Yeah, data never relates to each other. So like a marketing web visit doesn't ever relate to an order. Like it's like actually like there's a week dedicated to like just figuring out how to tie a web visit to an order. Then you have to deal with the fact that everyone has different identifiers. So your cookie and the person's cookie is changing, or they might not have any tracking on their front end because of like ad blockers, or they're using like a VPN or like a million things that stop people from being able to be tracked. And then orders, and then you have to kind of deal with that system. Data missing. When you do front end tracking, you're missing data. It's like everyone thinks everything is 80% accurate. It's not. It sucks. It's like really shitty. So you got to figure out how to like actually tie the data together and interpret it. And then when you do that, you have to figure out what is the question that the person is asking for from marketing. So often we think about ROI, right?
Mm-hmm.
Here's a great example of
Mm.
ROI problem.
Mm.
Um, we do this thing where a narrator try to help people understand how like ROI happens. So you look at Facebook's ad platform and they're telling you you're getting 4x ROI. And you're like, incredible. You look at Google's ad platform, it's like 3x ROI. You're like, great. Klaviyo is crushing it. It's giving you like, made you $20 billion from like their emails. And then you're like, you go to do data and you have to try to figure out like, first of all, why are all these numbers like so high? Because they're not real. And you try to, then your marketing team is like, hey, Facebook says 4x, your analysis says 0.9. Like you're saying we're losing 10 cents on every dollar, and Facebook's telling me they're making $4.
Wow.
And there's a huge work to understand because in like when we do in a narrator, we actually show them the right way. And we also replicate what Facebook is doing to show them what the differences is. So
Mm.
like, and what happens is all these companies are trying to make their product look better. It's like they're grading their own exams. So they have
Right.
all these things that they like package in like oh, we have a proprietary attribution model. And I'm like, what do you mean proprietary attribution? You're like attributing yourself credit for like everything. Like that's the
real big
proprietary.
pat on your own back from them. They're like, we're doing pretty good, right? And you're like,
Yeah, you're doing great. Like, and then they use these words and they explain it in ways that I think people like can wrap their like Google ads will say, oh, we're having a 30-day window with projections for your conversion. And you'll be like, that makes sense. Like if I convert within 30 days, it'll be great. That's not what it means though. It means that if you touch an ad and you convert any time, and no matter how many conversions you do after 30 days, it goes to Google. Well, guess what? You're launching Google ads and you're launching Facebook ads and you're sending emails. So what we would show them often is like one order, like an order might get attributed 3 times by 3 different Google campaigns. So Google will get 3 credits for that one order. Facebook will get 4 or 5 credits because their ads are super low cost per click. So if it's not even click if you see them. So they spread out their ads everywhere. So now that order got 4 points, like 4x the revenue on Facebook. And the Klaviyo, because that person has come to and received an email, which you're sending like every single month, they have a window. Now 4 emails, because you send 4 emails to people in a month, every one of those 4 campaigns gets attributed to that order. So alone on day 1, that order got attributed 16 times on your ad platform and email platform. And that's very misleading. So now when you're dealing with data, like, first of all, replicating all these weird models is a really hard data problem. You're doing stuff in time, you have to switch, like it's all these complexities. And replicating the right way of doing it is even harder. And not only that, to explain the difference and explain the right way. And all of these data ways, each one of these queries in traditional data doesn't work in time. Anyone who's familiar with SQL works in like identifier joins. It's like a VLOOKUP in Excel if you're familiar with that.
Yeah.
So you can't VLOOKUP for time. It's like look at the last 30 days and count how many happened within 30 days of this specific moment. You can't do that in SQL easily. So those kind of questions take thousands of lines of queries. And when I built Narrator, it was actually initially built to solve the time problem because I was like, all these marketing questions are super hard to do because they're all time-based and SQL doesn't work time-based. So I had to build a system that was time-based, but still compiled to SQL so you can use it everywhere else in your business.
Oh my gosh, it's just mind blowing. The fact that like 16 engagements are being, lined into one, it's like you're not really sure. I mean, that must be one of the problems that marketing teams are having setting up self-service marketing analytics. Why is it so difficult for companies to make this happen for themselves?
Data is just hard. Like I think the 2 reasons is that like everyone is trying to sell you a bag of goods that is designed to make them look good. So you're dealing with like Facebook is making their data hard to use so that you use their platform instead of getting the data. Now you get the data out of their system and you put it in your own world and you're like, great. Well, guess what? Every single front-end tracker is trying to keep you within their system. So they make it really like, even though there's free trackers exist out there, like,
right,
then you're still paying Amplitude like $100,000 to use their tracker, but they don't want you to use anyone else's system. So they make it kind of difficult. So you got to parse it, which requires engineering. And then you have to deal with combining your order data, which is coming from Shopify, which Shopify wants to keep you in its system. So it's giving you its own attribution.
right.
So now you have all this data in your warehouse and you're combining it. And as a data person, again, combining this idea of combining separate sources of data is relatively new. Like it didn't used to be that many different sources. Like in the last 20, 30 years is when we actually now exploded in like this, every single thing has its own source and you got to dump it somewhere and combine it. Right. So there's not that much experience out there in how to deal with it. And it's a lot of obfuscation. Like if you ask people like what is attribution model they're using, marketing people will like, some of them know, some of them don't know. Everyone loves, oh my God, the amount of companies that will sell you like a multi-touch machine learning attribution model. And you're like, why? Like, why? We once did we have this analysis that is called what attribution model should you use? And it like explains to you, it's like, let's think about attribution in general. Like, first of all, do you need like a multi-touch attribution model? And it's like, are people coming from multiple sources before they first convert? And like most companies, the answer is no. The answer is really no. Okay, great. Then you're like, so I don't need multi-touch. I already saved like a year of work in paying another company $100,000.
Great.
Then it's like, okay, now should I use first touch or last touch? Well, there's benefits from first touch and last touch. First touch is really good because you can get attribution at the moment the person comes. Last touch has things. So like, are people coming from when their first touch, is it changing? Like the problem is like, if you come from organic, are you later on coming from paid? It turns out no. If you're coming from paid, then do you come organically? Yes, because your browser caches it. Do you want to attribute that as organic or paid? You always want to attribute that as paid. So it ends up being that like 80% of the customers that run this analysis, it's like you should use first touch. And that's so much easier than all these obfuscated bullshit attribution models, because it makes sense. It's like, I got a person to come to my site via this click campaign. Now everything else that happens automatically. And then people go, but what about retargeting? You got to retarget people. It's like, yes, you really do. But like, in which ways? Like, what affects retargeting? Like, how many times have you received an ad for a platform that you already bought? Like,
oh, yeah.
I received
like,
ad.
Buying Cheetos, and then as I walk out, I get an ad for Cheetos. Buying tires, and they're like, here's a deal on tires. You're like, yeah, I needed that before, maybe.
Exactly. Like retargeting doesn't work for most ad retargeting, actually sucks. In cases, there's some cases where it's valuable, but like it's like for very specific ways. Actually, the best retargeting we found if you want to increase repeat rates is emails. Emails work the best. Like they tell you when something new is coming. They tell you when something's a discount. That's what you need to maintain. But all that information is so obfuscated that like you don't know what's working or not working. Like I still get like, I'll get ads for like Salesforce, and I'm like, we use Salesforce. Like I can't use it more. Like
maybe they're
like
just
I don't
like,
know what you
maybe
want
they,
me.
yeah. Do they think? But it's amazing to find out that obsession with cookies, that obsession with tracking, that obsession with making sure you're hitting individuals with personalized ads. And really, the tech is so complicated. And the fact that you can't really have an attribution model that can align with that. I mean, it really is such a can of worms, right?
Yeah, it truly is a can of worms that is deliberately done that way. Like I think that when you see the companies that do really well, and like people love to compare themselves to like Amazon, it's like don't. Like get better at understanding your own data. Like Amazon is they have so many different things going for them that they can afford to do like different kinds of retargeting and different things. Like you are not Amazon.
Right.
Amazon doesn't have to get you to like they're very different goals. So when you look at your own data and you try to understand your own system, I think what you find is often that like you should just kind of keep your system very, very clean. And even stuff like you're like, well, I checked the box, remove everyone who already converted. How come you're still getting ads? How come? How much money do you think you're losing on that? Like one of the other analysis that we do at Narrator when people start working with us is we say how much money is going to the trash? Like how many people have you already converted that you're still spending money on that you don't think you're spending money on? Because a lot of people turn that checkbox off, which is like do not retarget. And then they're like, wait, how come we're doing that? I checked the checkbox, do not retarget. And I'm like, yeah, the problem with all these tools, and actually this is really funny because Facebook has been sued every single year, like multiple lawsuits for this problem.
Yeah.
Is that we think we know what these words mean, like, but we don't. A lot of companies play this definition game really heavily. Like Facebook will say stuff like, don't retarget ads who already converted. And then you're like, okay, it sounds like acquire new customers. And if I acquire a customer, don't retarget them. Does it? Like Facebook once got in trouble for having definitions for like video plays, people who view the video.
Yes, I remember that lawsuit.
Yes, so they have it for video. They have it for redefining what a conversion is. They have it for like redefining what a click is. They have it for redefining what like a view is. Like what is happening there? Like there's so many things that they have redefined that like you as a user think you get it. You think you get it. Like even ROI. What do you think ROI means in Facebook ads?
That somebody converted, I would assume.
Yeah. So in theory, you would think ROI traditionally return on investment. How much money did we get from how much money we put in?
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, they give it to you per day. So they give it to you the moment you spend money. They say you spend money like today and your ROI is 30%. And you're like, how the fuck did you get a 3x ROI? What it actually means is given Facebook's proprietary model about your customer and how much they think that customer is going to, what likelihood that customer is going to convert and how many times they're going to buy we're going to assume their lifetime value, sum it up based on some weird logic, and I'm going to give credit to any campaign which I feel affected the customer, whether that was like an inline impression or whether a click. They have a weighted way of deciding it, and they combine it. So there's really no real information. Like, it's like this like really abstract complexity, and you're like, okay.
But it's designed to it's designed to make you feel good. Like the projection is complicated and complex because it makes you feel good. And it's like, isn't this working? You know, and if it's based on their an account's previous use of how many times they engage with an ad, I mean, it's so much math. But I bet a lot of people would just ship those reports and say it's looking good. But eventually they're going to find out that it isn't. I mean, do you have like a horror story of like data modeling or
yeah,
you know, that's just give us that. And then if you could pair it with a Cinderella story, you know, that might be good too. You know, give a little good and the bad. Start with the bad though.
So let's start with like kind of the bad, which is the problem with these obfuscation models is like you're driving a car where the steering wheel does all this magic before the wheel turns. So sometimes when you turn all the way to the left, it turns a little bit. Sometimes you turn a little bit, it turns a lot. Sometimes you turn left, it turns right. And what ends up happening as a person who's controlling this car, you have no way to steer it. So if you're trying to get somewhere, you're like, it's pretty much random, which means that you're moving a lot of the steering wheel trying to get somewhere and you're doing a lot of work. Very little results are happening.
Yes.
And I think that's a huge fundamental problem. So the more obfuscation layers, the more. So I'll give you a horror story. And this was actually in Pinterest. We were working with a customer and they were spending like $30,000, $40,000 a month on Pinterest ads. And they were spending so much money on different ads. And one of them, and they were like, oh, well, it's working. Like they're getting their revenue's growing. But what they realized was at some point, one second. Turning this thing. Sorry, my phone just decided.
Oh, it's all good.
Right. So anyway, Pinterest ads, they were having issues with, so they're like, okay, we're trying to evaluate our ads. And we did an analysis for them and it was like 0.7, which means every dollar they spend in Pinterest, they lose 30 cents. Pinterest was reporting like 6. Like they were saying that they're making $6 and everything. So they were actually, the horror story was they were actually about to move way more of their money into Pinterest. And instead, what we actually pushed them to do was they were like, no, there's no way you're right. There's no way this data is right. And I'm like, find me the data wrong. So actually the story continues where narrator is very transparent. You can see every single person who came to your site, every person who converted is very, very explicit. So they actually ended up like going to like an executive team at Pinterest and demanding their data, which you can actually do. So you can actually demand, and they want to know, give me the people that make up the 6X. Ooh, that's an interesting story. Getting that data, it was so clear that like these people that they were giving credit, like never even bought. Wow. Like they were giving credit for like things like, we were like, who the fuck are these? Like, and it ended up actually leading them into being like, okay, I'm going to kill. So they stopped spending money on Pinterest.
Wow.
And interestingly, they just turned fully off. They were like, instead of like, I think there was like 30, 50K a month, they said, go to 0. And what they were looking for was seeing, do their sales go down? And their sales didn't change. And they're just like, okay, well, that was now $40,000. I can use somewhere else.
Yes. Oh, and that's sort of a Cinderella story in the horror, actually, you know?
Yeah, this is definitely a horror in a Cinderella story in a horror. The other Cinderella story, I'll give you another one that is like more with the opposite of data, which is like actually I have a lot of horror. Actually, I have another horror story.
Okay, please. The campfire is lit. We have our marshmallows. We're ready.
Yeah, because a lot of these stories, I'm thinking about like the problems I faced and then how we solved it for customers and narrator.
Yes.
We once at WeWork spent so much money. We had this like one of these campaigns in marketing was doing so well. It was getting us like, so we in WeWork, we were judging ourselves and we had our internal metrics for this. Okay. So this wasn't even like the platform fucking up. This was us. And we had so we had our internal metrics and we were really judging based on tours, which is like people that came and saw the space. we had this campaign that was like in New York that was crushing it. It was getting so many tours. We're like, oh my God, this campaign is going so well. So we kept like pushing more and like more money on this campaign. And we noticed that the more money we put in the campaign, it didn't move. Like it was just like this weird like saturation where it was still giving us a lot of people, but it wasn't like more people came when we spent more money, which is known as saturation problem. It's like the more money you spend, the like it's already saturated. So there's no reason to do it. But we were like very confused because when we looked at the past, one of the things that we were doing analysis and we said, well, this is interesting. This like the number of tours in that location before we started spending money on the ad and after we spent money on the ad has been relatively consistent. So we were looking into the data more, and this is an interesting problem of an attribution problem. So what happened was one of the community managers, people who like the front desk people who take in the customer, had actually WeWork gets a lot of walk-ins. Right. Actually clicked on an ad. And like I said, they clicked on an ad, like they were Google WeWork, they clicked on an ad, and they kept, whenever somebody would check in, instead of using our internal systems, they would check them in on, they would book the tour for them on the browser. Classic, everyone does this, like it's just nicer UI than our admin UI, which is things. So what's happening is their cookie was constantly getting attributed to wins. So like it was like this ad tied to this cookie. This cookie was constantly getting like another tour. And it was like a very, very big, like known as like, this is like an identity resolution problem, which is how do you break it? So like one of the things that we did at Narrator, because of this horror story, because we ended up spending way too much money on this like computer that like such a bad situation. What we ended up doing is investing a lot in identity resolution. So like assuming like, again, we talked about like building a system for the shit. So like, how do you build identity stitching with cookies? Assuming computers are shared and people have multiple computers and people change their computers and cookies get reset. And all these things are happening all the time. Like, how do you build identity stitching where you can build a clear image of that user without that? So if you had Narrator, that would have never happened. But it was a crazy thing to see how easy that, like, you can see how like all these seamless things can easily happen. I'm just using the computer, but how much it affects when you're doing data reporting and you're not careful.
Wow. Oh my God, I love that. Okay, so give us a Cinderella story. Give us something that was like, everything, went to the moon,
Yeah, so we had one of the other Cinderella stories was we had a customer. They were about to, they had just signed up for Narrator and they do that attribution model. They were like very, very data driven. So they were like, okay, we trust you. We did that attribution model and they said, use First Touch. And what they were doing actually was really interesting. With First Touch model, they were using two ad platforms, Facebook and Google. And pretty much all they were really doing was just shifting money from Google's Facebook based on First Touch attribution. And what was happening was really interesting. As they were using Narrator, they ended up building such fine motor control. So it was so fine that when their CEO came to their marketing team and said, okay, I want to get like this many sales, but like I need them to come like within like 2 weeks because I want to do a big press release. So a marketing team getting that kind of constraint is a challenge. Mm-hmm. They were like, we got it. They had built such fine motor skills from like what their action and seeing the reaction was so fine that they were like, okay, we're actually going to spend money in the lower ROI converter, but it converts way faster. So if you want to get that thing by this date, here's how much we can spend. And that was an interesting thing to see marketing people make those specific decisions to say, this one is definitely a higher cost per CAC, cost per acquisition, right? But it converts way faster. So we're going to pound this thing with a lot more to get faster conversions. And they had also known the saturation point, which is like often way larger than people assume. Like everyone is worried about saturation, but it doesn't happen. Or cannibalization. Cannibalization and saturation are two things that every marketing person loves to talk about, but are much rarer than you think. It's like seasonality is like sometimes important, but like not as important as you think. Right. So anyway, it was like they actually ended up getting like a really big bonus. They were really excited. But the thing that they saw was that they had control over their system. And when they later on gave like how they did it, their biggest thing was like having a system where it felt like the feedback loop made sense. Like I turned left, it turned left. And they just knew. And they didn't need that many levers. It's like really like there's like 3 levers in marketing. How much does it cost? how long does it take somebody to convert, and are they a customer who would like have a high lifetime value or low lifetime value? That's like the real leverage. So if you really want to, you can play with money in and out and figure out how to use it to get any outcome you want. It's up to you. And I think that predictability is like the most incredible Cinderella story, because you get predictability over like random magic efficiency that people promise with machine learning algorithms. You don't want that. You want predictability. Choose predictability and control, and your marketing team will be so fucking happy.
Ahmed, you've dropped some science on us, a lot of interesting ways that things can be misattributed, how you can slim up the way you're measuring performance. But if you had to consolidate all of this deliciousness into a fine sauce and just give one piece of advice for marketers and advertisers out there when it comes to data management, what would that piece of advice be?
I think the last thing I said is probably the best thing. I said choose predictable, like really, 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 really choose stuff that you can understand more than fancy shit, and just be aware that the people that are selling you are very, very, very biased. So people love to sell you things that are very complicated and hide and say that everything is so complicated and you need all these things.
Right.
Like the question is always, do you? Like, do you? And I think when you work with, like, we're a data platform, so like we're not really, we work with marketing and all sorts of different kinds of data. So we have no really, we're just helping you use your data. There's no incentive for you to make like your ROI is great, but like our ability is to help you use data. So we don't really care what you end up doing with it. And one of the things that we often do with customers in analysis is saying, like, ask the question before you jump into complexity. Ask yourself, do you need that complexity? And what is the trade-off with that complexity? Before you start like trusting in a company, ask yourself, what is their incentive? And I think a lot of times you'll realize that like you don't need multi-touch. I don't think most people ever need multi-touch attribution. I've never met a case where someone really needed it. And the trade-off is really huge. And I don't think you need like secret complex, another company buying data and selling it to you to figure out who your customer is. Like you have enough data. So like transparency, trust, clarity, those things drive a lot better. There's a known thing in the military. There's a book about what's called the Ooda Loop. And it was like in World War II, people were trying to figure out how the US was like outdoing like another country. I think it was Japan at that time. I don't remember. The book really reminded me. But anyway, there was two US versus another country. Another country had faster airplanes that were more powerful, that were like just better at maneuvering. And they did the person who did the analysis ended up writing a book on it, which is like, how the hell did we win? Like, really, how did we win? And what they found out was that the biggest difference between our stuff, even though our technology was shittier, was that our windshield was a lot bigger. So what that allowed the people to do was they actually had more visibility, that they can actually see more and be more transparent and then maneuver. And I think that's an interesting application for data. Like if you have data that's clear that you can trust, and you have these systems that are transparent, that you can really connect with, and it feels like you have control over, you can always do better. The more obfuscation like might appear better in the beginning, but you can't really improve it because it's just this like very blurry thing that you're looking through. So I would always say choose simple, choose clear, and leverage that to be better.
So, I mean, I remember I'm on Twitter a lot talking to marketers and stuff, and I was sort of putting a metaphor out there of, do you think you'd be able to be more tactically efficient in a fighter jet that has a full heads-up display, all the metrics you could possibly need, or like a Sopwith Camel glider that only has like a couple things, a couple levers? What do you think would help you more in the long range? You know, and it started this really interesting conversation, and it was also in between the types of pilots that are behind the wheel. So but it also speaks to what you're saying, is that you can have a lot of these tight constraints and dials and everything's in there, but what do you trade off in the ways you can pivot or understand the arena in which you're, engaging? And if you're thinking more simplistic, you're thinking more predictable, you'll probably win. But also, a very simple thing is just the size of your windshield. I mean, that's huge. What's that called? The Ooda Loop? What'd you say?
The Ooda Loop, yeah. ODOOO. It stands for like uh, orient, determine,
Decide.
observe, and I don't remember. But anyway, it's a really good book. So I think that's a good question you asked, and I'll say two parts, right? I lean toward extreme constraints and extreme like make it very simple, make it very accurate, and put a lot of constraints, and let people be creative in using and working within the constraints. Like I think of the world as Legos. Like I think if you think of the world as Legos, you can imagine building anything with Legos, and you will have like the basic structure and the basic foundation of it works.
Right.
If you're cast molding or 3D printing, you can make way more finer, tuner things. But guess what? It's going to be way less structurally sound. It's going to be way more complicated. It's like really things.
Right.
And you often don't know how accurate things are. The more complicated things are, like when you're looking at 13 different metrics and 13,000 dashboards, the person can't put as much accuracy in each one of them. And you don't know how accurate each one is. You don't know how reliable each one is. You don't know the assumptions that each one makes. So now you're working with like 50,000 pieces of misinformation that you don't know how accurate it is, which like is really bad versus a couple of really good. Like, I don't know if you know, Narrator. So before Narrator, you're building tables, and these tables are whatever you want to build. And you take those tables and you put them in your BI tool and you slice and dice it.
Right.
And companies have like 600, 800, like of this middle transformation layer.
Sure.
So think about, and then you can do anything you want. You have SQL. You can literally do anything you can do in SQL. It's open-ended. It's like coding language.
Yeah.
If you think about what Narrator has done, here are the constraints that Narrator has. Narrator is one table. It's 11 columns. You have a very specific, finite, the same 11 columns for every company in the world. So going custom everything you want and anything you need with as many columns you want. We were like, here's the rules. Standard structure, really big constraints, really simple, really easy. When you go to relate data in Narrator, you have to there's no fanciness. It's all within time. And you can do a couple of things. It's like you have one main drop down that's 10 options that connects data. Now you would think that with this much constraint, you would be able to answer way less questions, right? You would think that you would be able to, it would be harder because you have to work within constraints. The opposite, and so far from it. We can answer questions like 20 times faster because the user doesn't have to relearn anything. You already know the constraints and boundaries. You're just thinking about, how do I put my question in this boundaries? It's like, how do I use Legos to build a box versus how do I build a box in there? Also, when you add more layers of complexity, as you build like more complicated Legos, the complexity doesn't, like if you try to build like a loop in Legos, you can understand how that works. If you try to build a loop in like a cast molding or anything that's custom, wow, that level of complexity continues to expand. And the more you're trying to build, the more complexity, the more that curve gets harder and everything takes longer and everything is more nuanced. And I think that's a difference. So constraint, simplicity ends up everything you can do in the traditional data you can do in Narrator, and you can do a lot faster. And we don't hear a lot of people complaining about data. Nobody's complaining about data integrity issues because it's so simple. Like everything is so transparent and clear that you don't run into issues. Versus the more complexity you have, the more custom you have, the more hidden, the more issues you will always run into.
I don't know. My mind is, you can't see it, but my hair has been blown back. So you have been amazing. We have learned so much about better data management, how to engage with data, how to not be so confused. I know people want to learn more about Narrator. They want to find you online. How can people connect with you, Ahmed, and learn more about this?
Yeah, so I think that probably most active on LinkedIn and Twitter. So my LinkedIn is just Google, look for Ahmed Elsamdisi. I think my name is one or two. And then for Twitter, my handle is AE for the number 4, AI. So it's just and I usually post up all about these kind of concepts. We also Narrator, go to our website, check out our blog. We do write a lot about these things. We try to like share a lot of like how to do this and very explicit, more useful information. on how to do things. Yeah, and if you're ever interested, go check out, see a demo of Narrator. Like, go put it to the test, like, see how it actually works. Because I think people will be, there's a lot of, like, we still spend most of our time with customers asking us if what we do is possible because we have constrained the system so much. And I've done this in every talk I've given, and this is a podcast, not a talk, but if you come to any of my talks, I will ask the audience and be like, ask me any question. Like, let's choose a question from the audience, and I'll take whatever question ends up coming. Like, I won't pick multiple options. I'll just choose the random person, take their question, and live answer that question in Narrator. And I think having done that so often, I think you can see so many variations. So you can see like why within the constraints, Narrator still can answer any question. And I don't have to worry about what the question is because I know the system is quality built with constraints, with simplicity. So any question can be broken down into our world and just easily answered. And I think that's the goal. So I'm excited for anyone to really start sharing and asking questions and diving into stuff with us.
Cheese or chocolate?
Are you ready?
Ready.
Okay. Cheese or chocolate?
Oh, chocolate.
Rap or rock?
Rock.
Gandalf or Dumbledore?
Dumbledore. Where's Gandalf even from?
Don't feel, you can just say how you want. This is a safe space.
I don't remember. I'm like, where is characters from?
See, I was worried about that one. Gandalf, Lord of the Rings, Dumbledore, Harry Potter.
I've never seen Lord of the Rings. That explains a lot. So I have to pick Dumbledore just because I've never seen Lord of the Rings.
Well, I'll tell you, talk about complexity. There's a lot going on in those books. You're like, wrap it up. They spend like 7 pages singing about a hill. Just get to the action. Anyway, write it down on paper or voice memo?
Oh, paper all the time.
Love paper. Isn't that interesting?
I have like 50 notebooks. I have like literally 50 notebooks. I also write my code in paper. Like when I code on paper and pen first before I even write a code on like computers. So like, I love it.
That's awesome. Summer or winter?
Summer.
And finally, Batman or Superman?
Superman.
Okay. Do you want to explain why Superman?
Well, I think Superman just like, it's like Batman has like really nothing, no powers, right? Like he's just like rich and has like a couple of weapons. I feel like Superman is definitely an overpowered character that is unnecessary. So like it's like weird. He has all these like invisible, like insane powers, and then his only like weakness is this one piece of jewel, which I feel like Batman would take advantage of. But I feel like if it was like today's age, I think actually if it was me personally, and I got to pick whether I would be Batman or Superman, I think I'd definitely be I'll be Batman. Because when Batman is not Batman, he's still like a billionaire badass who like does whatever the fuck he wants. And when Superman is not Superman, he's like really boring. So I think if I had to pick who I would be, I think I'd definitely pick Batman. But I think if I had to guess who I would think is like more powerful or more cool, I feel like Superman is like a more interesting person.
What Gets Measured is a NinjaCat podcast. Please rate and review the show wherever you find your podcasts. Share this episode on social and visit us on the web at ninjacat.io.